No mai haere mai. Kia ora tātou. Rongomaraeroa kia koutou. Welcome everyone. My name's Richard Jackson and I'm the co-director of Te Ao o Rongomaraeroa, the National Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies here at the University of Otago. And very, very delighted today to host this talk on John's New Zealand tour. And without any further ado, I'll just hand over to Liz, who will introduce John to us. We're looking forward to this, and we've got plenty of time, so get your questions ready for the end.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Kia ora. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Ko Liz Hughes aho, he tangata tiriti aho. No airangi taku tipuna, ko hamuana toko kāinga. I tipuaka I Heratonga I te rohe o Kahungunu. I was raised in Heratonga and Hawke's Bay in the lands of Ngāti Kahungunu. Ko te mata te manga nana aho. Te mata is the mountain that sheltered me. And here, Tuki Tuki te awa. Tuki Tuki's the river. I live on the shores of the Tuki Tuki River. E mihi ana kia koutou. Thank you so much, Richard, for hosting John and also for organising this gathering. And also I'd like to thank all the Quakers who've been involved throughout Aotearoa. John's been travelling throughout Aotearoa with his wife Laurie for the last 2 or 3 weeks, arriving on Waitangi Day. So, and then speaking right throughout the North Island and Te Waipunam, about 13 talks, I think. So it's fantastic that we can host him. And just a few words about John. He and I are both involved in World Beyond War. I'm the Vice President of World Beyond War and the National Coordinator for Aotearoa, and John is the Treasurer. And he's also, he's got a career as an emergency physician, as he'll mention. And he has been practicing, teaching and studying alternatives to violence for about 40 years. Has taught in University Peace and Conflict Studies in Vermont. And he's also very active with Physicians for Social Responsibility, especially on the Committee to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. John's also served on volunteer unarmed peace teams in Haiti, Guatemala, Colombia, Palestine, Israel, and several US inner cities. And he's deployed in South Sudan for 4 months in 2019 as an international protection officer with the Nonviolent Peaceforce. He's also been, was there helping protect people on the day that the US Capitol was stormed in 2021. And his one of his most recent things is working in Ukraine, inspired by the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors at the Zaporizhzhya power plant, calling for a safety zone around that. So without further ado, I'd like you to give a warm welcome to Dr. John Reuwer. Kia ora.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. Volume good? Thank you, Professor Jackson and the University of Otago for inviting us here. This is nearing the end of an almost 5-week tour of Aotearoa, meeting wonderful people everywhere, seeing your incredibly gorgeous land, but especially for me, learning about the major contributions that Aotearoa, New Zealand has made to world peace. We'll say plenty about those. And I'm here to learn as much as I am to talk, so I look forward to interesting discussion. So I was an emergency physician for most of my career, and after 30 to 40 years of fixing people up for what they do to each other, and often to themselves, I decided it was time for prevention. And so what I do now, I consider mostly violence prevention. There's lots of kinds of violence in the world, isn't there? We have domestic violence at home, we have street violence. I've heard about the gangs in the cities here. Our host has had his car stolen. Lots of different kinds of violence, poverty, structural violences. But war is in a special category. All those other things, generally people agree on, we don't like those. There's always prevention programs. How do we stop crime? How do we stop violence? How do we stop homicides? But war is a special bird, isn't it? We take our children, young men and women, and everything we taught them to do and not to do as children, we suddenly reverse that and say, no, now you have to become a killer. Now you have to blow up and destroy things in order to serve whatever interest the authorities say needs to be served. And so it's the most egregious kind of violence, and it's the only one that is a cultural decision and not something that has to be done or part of our faulty nature. It's a cultural decision. And so with World Beyond War, we try to see what makes people go to war. And in my opinion, the overwhelming answer is the fact that that's what we've been conditioned to. Basically, the propaganda. Every war movie I ever saw, every good cop show, the good guys did not win by being good. They won by out-violencing the bad guys in 98% of those movies. And that kind of belief that violence is the final arbiter of conflict is easy to believe for two reasons. One, people don't count the full cost of war. They count the soldiers dead, they might count the military budget that went into the war, but they don't count the PTSD, the treatment that those vets, or the violence they'll visit upon their families and communities for the rest of their lives, the medical care they'll need for the rest of their lives. They don't count the environmental damage. How many people are counting all the children from the Vietnam War who are still losing their legs over cluster bombing? And here we sent more cluster bombs into Ukraine. So all those costs aren't counted. I'm guessing you're all here not too worried about the cost of it or you wouldn't be here. The second thing is people just don't know the alternatives. What do you do about the people you see as enemies that may actually, or you're perceived to be attempting to hurt you? And at World Beyond War, we spend our time looking for those alternatives and making practical use of them, educating people in them, and doing some of them. So that's what we'll focus on this evening. Why abolish war at all? Well, the single biggest reason is nuclear weapons. You know, you've seen the pictures of what Mariupol looks like. You see what Gaza looks like. In the war in Ukraine in particular, where nuclear-powered NATO keeps punching nuclear-powered Russia and back and forth, we have to remember that Putin is perfectly capable of making every major European city and every city in the US look like Mariupol in a couple of hours if he so chooses. And there's nothing we can do to prevent that. Why would we take that risk in any case? And we could talk about all the ways to prevent that besides poking the bear. The people that have followed the threat of nuclear war since the bombings in the 1940s tell us now that they think there's more risk of this than ever. And why? Because Russia and NATO are at odds. China and the US are at odds in the South China Sea. North Korea is, and I call it NATO Pacific because they forget where the North Atlantic is, but there's a lot of Pacific nations getting involved in the same treaty. India and Pakistan, two nuclear-armed powers that have actually had a hot shooting war intermittently for the last 30 years. And then Israel and Iran, which does not have nuclear weapons, but is constantly threatened by the nuclear power Israel. And members of the Israeli Knesset, at least one woman, actually said, we just need to nuke Gaza and be done with it. So these weapons are out there. We're renewing them all, spending lots of money on them. And praise to you New Zealanders for not getting involved with that. Other reasons, if you think magically, like the people that believe in deterrence seem to think that nuclear weapons have some magical property that, unlike everything else we've ever made, will never fail, is impressive. But if you believe that, war still kills and traumatizes all living things. It steals resources from real human needs. And many more human beings die from preparations for war, both things like nuclear testing and all that, but also just the fact that those resources, which could feed people and prevent disease, are being used to prepare to traumatize people and cause starvation instead of helping people. War damages the environment like nothing else. I mean, just look at the bombed cities. Look at Gaza now. And it's not just the buildings that you can rebuild. It's the munitions and the unexploded ordnance and all the toxic chemicals from all those explosions that are going to cause cancers and other problems for decades. Erode civil liberties. I was in Ukraine. Not everybody wants to fight for Ukraine and that, but young men between 17 or 65 aren't allowed out. There's very little political freedom or opposition parties allowed. And there's very little freedom other than to buy stuff. And then war always begets more war. And I challenge anybody here, if they can think of a time in history where one war absolutely ended any chance that those people were going to war again or be involved in another war, please let me know that war can actually end at least one section. I don't know of any, that I can't describe the next war as partly caused by the last one. So World Beyond War, we're a bit unique among peace groups. And in our 10-year history, we've painfully learned that about 90% of groups that call themselves peace groups spend more time bickering about who's right and who's wrong and which weapon systems are good and which weapon systems are bad, that we said, no, war is the problem. It's not either side, it's war itself. And the battle is not between the two sides, but people who believe in mass slaughter and destruction and people who don't. We have an exception in World Beyond War. I generally believe that human beings respond better to positive inducements to say, let's work on peace, and not against something like war. But war is an exception. It is so thoroughly infiltrated into absolutely every aspect of our culture and society that we at World Beyond War believe you cannot truly work for peace if you're not also against war. We are a worldwide movement. We're not an organization just in the United States. As Liz said, she's our coordinator here. We have people working in lots of countries. We have our signatures to our Declaration of Peace, which we hope you'll all agree with and sign before you leave, in 195 countries. We're a global nonviolent movement to end war and establish a just and sustainable peace. And two people have pointed out, and I'll apologize up front, that you can't quite see New Zealand on our little map there, and I apologize. You're probably used to that. So our ideas for alternatives are summarized in this book called Alternative Global Security System. And we have not only the reasons we think war can be abolished, but also the things that we think need to be put in place if you want to figure out other ways to deal with potential enemies that we describe. It's in three categories: demilitarizing security, managing conflicts without violence, and creating a culture of peace. We'll talk about those some. We have a lovely graphic. I think we have some if people want to take one. A nice artistic rendition of many of the things in the book that we think need to be done in these three areas. So let's talk about some of them. Demilitarizing security, we talk about moving from a non-provocative defense away from an offensive posture, phasing out military bases, disarmament, military alliances, outlining the arms trade. You know, Pope Francis is probably the most anti-war pope since Peter, maybe. And when people pushed him, he's totally against the war in Ukraine, but he didn't condemn just Russia. He said war is the problem, and the people of Europe have really vilified him for this. And they pushed him and pushed him and said, well, come on now, you're really saying Ukraine can't use weapons to defend us? He says, well, it's not the best way, but if they have to, at least no one should make a profit doing it. And the world's arms trade is worth about $250 billion to these companies now. Economic conversion and civilian-based defense, we'll talk about a little bit. But these are just good ideas. Good ideas are wonderful, but unless they can be put into practice, what good are they? So I want to point out a few examples where these things that seem radical to some people actually have happened or are happening. And if they have happened, we can do more of them. Let me give you two examples of a different way to approach your defense of your country. One is Switzerland, and just in Christchurch, we were at the Peace Bell there, and who's standing there with a lovely couple from Switzerland that we got to confirm some of this stuff with. So they have military security where every male gets trained in military defense, and it keeps a weapon in their house. And they have every road that possibly you could invade through blocked off. They have automatic bridge collapses and blockades that come down. And they're just set in like barns on the side of the road. But then if in the time of invasion, they would just come and block the road and almost make themselves impenetrable. But they don't have offensive weapons. Although I hear they're going to purchase F-35s, which is clearly an offensive weapon. But for the most part, Switzerland has not threatened anybody. And the result is they haven't been invaded since, if anybody knows better, this Swiss couple didn't know, but sometime in the 16th or early 17th century. They had a civil war among themselves in 1860 or something, but before that, they haven't been invaded for many centuries. Costa Rica, on the other hand, in 1949, abolished its army. And it's one of, I've visited most of the Central American countries. You know, when they got free from Spain, they mostly went into war, civil wars with each other, usually one side supplied by the US and against indigenous people. But Costa Rica refused to do that. And the result is they have the best standard of living and have had the least crime and the least, and no wars at all since 1949. They actually were invaded once, about a year after they did this. Nicaragua invaded them, but they reconstituted their militia, pushed the Nicaraguans back, and haven't been invaded since 1949. So we know it can be done. There are 22 countries in the world that have no official army, and none of them have been invaded. So there's something else going besides hard threat power that keeps people safe. The Costa Rica story can be seen in this movie, A Bold Peace. I highly recommend everybody watch that. It'll give you a lot of hope. Phasing out military bases. So who has the most military bases in the world? Yeah. I mean, by unbelievable number. I think the next is maybe Russia with 12 or something outside its borders. China with 3 or 4. And after that, it's like hardly anybody has any. And we have, this says 750 when I made this slide from one resource, but now World Beyond War has its own database that I'll show you if we have time later that shows them all. So what do you do about that? Let me give you an example. Montenegro was one of those new countries in NATO that Putin complained about. And when they became a NATO country, they have to start training for military NATO exercises. And they picked this beautiful mountain top, it's a huge pasture. It's the second largest highland pasture in Europe, surrounded by UNESCO natural heritage sites. And NATO came up and started firing artillery. And these shepherds and goat herds just went nuts. So we can't do this. So they started blocking, they got out with their bodies and blocked it. Luckily, they were able to enlist environmentalists from all over Europe to help protect that site. And so they had lots of people come intermittently, hundreds at some point, and block the military trucks. They found out about us, asked for help, and we did webinars with them. I met many, many times on Zoom from some of these real fighters. This one lovely young woman who spoke excellent English, her mother, you could see her on a horse like Bryce in 1881, a white horse leading everything. Standing in front of these troops and stuff, it's just terrific. But we gave them our War Abolisher of the Year award for their efforts a few years ago. That got them a lot of worldwide coverage. And each government said, okay, we won't do it. And then they backslid. Finally, just in the last month, the Prime Minister of Montenegro said we're dropping all plans to do further military training there. So it can be done, that kind of resistance. Treaties. This is the first time I've been able to give a talk to people who actually know about treaties. You ever heard of a treaty here that gets a lot of attention? I mean, it's amazing. We got 2 days for the treaty celebration there. We went to Parahaka, learned a lot about, I hope that's not me. But these treaties are extremely effective. So biological weapons were banned in 1972. Chemical weapons in 1993, and the US and most other countries in the world signed these. Does that mean there's no chemical weapons? No, but it means there's not a lot of chemical weapons. The US announced this year that its chemical stockpile had been totally disbanded. It took 30 years to get rid of those toxic chemicals. Landmines were banned by a lot of countries, not the US. Cluster munitions, and this is a good story about cluster munitions, right? Because they're big news in Ukraine. Well, the US didn't sign the cluster munition treaty. And I think either Ukraine or Russia, one of them did and one of them didn't, but they're both using them now. So it didn't stop all cluster munition use, but the one factory in the United States that manufactured cluster munitions shut down after this treaty because they were so worried about not getting enough new orders. And so those treaties, even though they don't do everything, like Watangi didn't do the job it was supposed to do, right? But it still matters to you all, doesn't it? It's huge, actually. And then my favorite was the nuclear weapons treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons in 2017, when 122 nations adopted it, and then they have to ratify it over years, and it became international law for the states parties in 2021. So now, after waiting for nuclear powers who signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1970 and promised to get rid of their nuclear weapons if the other states didn't get them, has totally reneged on that. And so the non-nuclear countries got together and said, we're going to prohibit them. We're no longer seeing them as a badge of honor or something to be proud of. They're not only immoral, which they've always been, now illegal. And it's given many, many people, including New Zealand, a lot of power to, and of course, New Zealand signed that treaty. Managing conflicts without violence, we'll talk about what a proactive security posture means. Instead of waiting for the enemy to come to you and hurt you, you reach out to them before they come and hurt you. Multi-track diplomacy, international law, this whole concept of unarmed civilian protection, treaties again, the United Nations, and we have a representative here who I want to hear from, and becoming a little more democratic with the way money is handed out and so forth, right? It's the IMF and the World Bank, and now China's sort of doing it. You know, Big Brother lends all this money and then everybody owes them. So what is a proactive security? How do people usually solve problems if they're not going to shoot each other? What do nations do instead of going to war immediately? Diplomacy? Sure. So just look at when the Ukraine war broke out. I didn't know anything about Ukraine, but I know a lot about it now. I said, well, why did that happen? And there's all kinds of stuff. But one of the things that happened is when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, I looked up all the US military expenditure. This is just the Pentagon budget, which is about probably 80% of the total we spend on weapons, lots of other expenditures, but $16 trillion in that 20 years before the Ukraine war. Our diplomacy budget, which includes our entire State Department, USAID, all our foreign money, and our Peace Corps, lovely thing, total amount spent was about $900 billion in that same time. So if you were planning for war, planning for peace, which would you get just looking at these, how much you invested in it? And then you learn that something like 30% of the State Department budget is used to sell weapons around the world. The US sells weapons or trains the militaries of every dictatorship and authoritarian government in the world, except Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, and Cuba. Multi-track diplomacy, what's that? When the big boys don't seem to be getting the job done, and there's still a lot of stress like there was during the whole Cold War and the nuclear buildup, International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, which I was part of, not only gave a lot of talks to educate people and ask them, do you really want this? And if not, let's get rid of them. But they also went to the big people. So Bernard Lown in Boston and Eugene Chazov, Gorbachev's personal physician, got together and kept talking to their leaders and starting a movement and met with doctors across the borders. And it made all the difference in the world. I'm still an activist because giving talks like this is the most speaking, by the way, I've done since 1983 when the nuclear war danger was so great. We changed the leaders' minds, and since then, we got rid of 80% of nuclear weapons. How many people know that there's 80% fewer nuclear weapons now than there was in 1985? It's an amazing thing. So if anybody tells you you can't have a treaty that works, tell them you just look at history. We got rid of 80% of nuclear weapons. I didn't used to like to wear a peace sign because during the Vietnam War, there were pictures of this and it said footprint of the American chicken. And I just thought it was kind of a divisive symbol until I learned that the symbol, does anybody know this? The Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in Britain invented it. But if you know what semaphore language is, flag signal language, it's ND for nuclear disarmament. What's cool about this particular piece is it's made from a dismantled US ICBM, part of the copper wiring from the ICBM. So now I'm proud to wear it. International law. So after World War II, before World War II, whoever had the biggest army was just kind of expected to win a war and take over. That's the way it's been for all of history, right? World War II was so god-awful that people said, let's change the rules a little bit. The mistake they made, in my opinion, was they said you can no longer have an aggressive war. If you win a war, you got to give the land back. No more conquest, which is why, I don't know if you know this, but when the UN was formed, I think there were maybe 65 or 70 nations in the world. Now there's 210. It's because you could be a little guy and not get gobbled up because it's an agreement among the nations of the world that we won't do that anymore. The mistake they made, of course, was not banning all war, because anybody know who's really good at determining a defensive from an offensive war? I don't know any war makers who can tell the difference. Certainly not Putin, and really not even Zelensky, if you look at actually what happened there. Strengthen the international criminal court. So that's to go after individuals. The International Court of Justice goes after states and makes rulings on international law. Why is this important? Incredibly important. We are at a watershed like we haven't been in my lifetime, right? Because a Holocaust was so awful, everybody said, well, how do you prevent such a thing from happening? Well, how do you prevent any conflict? It's courts and rule of law. So people signed the Genocide Convention, including Israel and the United States, and most other countries. And they said, if that law says, if you see something that looks like genocide, tell us. We don't want to know about it afterwards. And if we rule that it is, then you have to stop and other countries have to punish you for it. Literally, they use the word punishment. So it took a full 3 months, but South Africa finally got the guts to take it to court. And them doing that doesn't let them judge Israel as having genocide. I mean, all it takes is a couple of views of TikToks day in and day out, and most people think it is, but the courts are the ones that determine that. Now, did it stop Israel? And they ruled that, yes, this looks like genocide. We're going to look into this. Stop any genocidal behavior. Here's the things listed in the convention. Don't do them. Israel, of course, has totally ignored that. But see, even for us activists in DC who are confronting our Secretary of State and these Congress people all the time, they said, it's not genocide. That's ridiculous. It's not genocide. Now we say, oh, that's not your job to tell us whether it's genocide. That's the court's job, the court that you agreed to. Let them tell us it's genocide. They're suggesting it is. And it changes the conversation some. It's strength for the peace. Unarmed civilian protection. Who's heard of that term before? Okay. It's a little known concept, incredibly powerful. I studied some of this alternative stuff back in the 80s. And after teaching it for a few years, I got an opportunity in the early 90s to join Christian peacemaker teams, actually doing it in Israel, and then first in Haiti, and then in Palestine. And I was astounded what 4 people can do to just get in the way of soldiers beating on people. You know, what people will do in the dark, they are less likely to do in the light. And just establishing relationships with these young Israeli soldiers and say, you know, you don't have to do that. And they almost always stop. And it takes a lot of training to do that, but less training than it takes to be a soldier. And so Nonviolent Peaceforce is the first time I actually got paid to do it, which is pretty cool, just the feeling of somebody pay you to be an unarmed peacekeeper. And I found the same thing there. You'd have 2 lines of opposition rebels and the government forces, you know, 10 kilometers apart. People would show you all the villages that they burned, and they'd all had stories of their families being killed or raped, and everybody was tense. It was a peace agreement had been signed, but they'd always broken it. And part of our mission there was just to go back and forth between the two to stop some local conflict from working out that would ignite the whole thing again. Incredibly useful. The problem is we never had more than about 8 people in one place. You know, this has to be done on scale. Not necessarily with masses of troops, but in so many places that you can always hit the hot spot. And one of the great stories, the 3 things I came to learn more about New Zealand, besides the nuclear-free zone, was what y'all did at Bougainville. Who here knows, has seen this movie, Soldiers Without Guns, or know about Bougainville? See, it's a minority still. Share that movie, have your friends over. So Bougainville was a terrible civil war, one of the worst in the Solomon Islands area. And they'd killed tens of thousands of people. It had gone on for, 20 years or something. Multiple peacekeeping missions went in, and it broke every time. So New Zealanders, a bunch of brave New Zealanders went in, let's try something else. And luckily, the New Zealand Defense Force has incorporated a lot of Maori culture, including the haka in this. And so when these native Bougainvillers saw people that looked a little more like them doing things that they were a little more used to, rather than white people telling them what to do with guns, it broke. So they took no guns. They took guitars and haka and goodwill. And that, since I've been here, I've talked to 3 people. One person was there on that peacekeeping mission, Fiona Cassidy. One guy who was there shortly thereafter, and one guy who just got back from there and said, yes, everybody remembers that. They think the wonder of New Zealand. They think of New Zealand as just this wonderful country. And it's not been reproduced yet. Why? Got to figure that out. Especially when all the unarmed, the UN spends about $6 billion on peacekeeping operations. And most of them have a pretty poor track record, as Richard points out in his book. Some have been successful, but there's been as many problems. You always hear about cholera outbreaks and rapes, and things. I mean, think about sending young men, take them away from their families and girlfriends, give them a gun, and put them in a vulnerable population. Is that really a good recipe for peace? And this works. Nobody got killed on that mission. So back to Ukraine, right? I went to Ukraine a few months after it broke out. I tried to go in at the start of the war, and there just wasn't any way to get in because everybody's just rushing humanitarian aid in and weapons in. But I thought Ukraine is going to resist Russia without a war. Why? Because in my lifetime, Russia owned Ukraine, right? They were just a Soviet vassal state. And they somehow got their freedom without a war and destroying their country. And then in 2004, when there was a faulty election where a pro-Russian guy got in and everybody knew it was a faulty election, people got in the streets by the millions. The movie about this I showed in my classes on nonviolent action. It was tremendous. Occupation of the streets for months and months. They demanded a new election, got a free and fair election, and another guy won. Now the problem started, that guy they elected was such a terrible politician that they voted the Russian guy back in 2 years later, and that led to all the problems in 2014, which is much messier because there was so much CIA involvement from the U.S. But anyway, we all saw, how many people watched the news for that first 2 weeks of the war, right? Did you see people in front of tanks and switching street signs? Anybody see some of that? And the Russians would arrest the town's mayor and the people go down and rescue them. Happened all the time. I was watching it with a bunch of other people who do this, and it was amazing. And then after about 2 to 3 weeks, it all disappeared. Why? Because this barrage of tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons. And there just wasn't any room for this. So I have a friend, Felipe Daza, who's a Spaniard. He was living in Ukraine before and for the first 6 months after the war. And his thing was to document all those episodes. And in this book, he talks about 245 different episodes where the Ukrainians resisted Russian aggression fairly effectively and categorizes it all according to the taxonomy we have now. Brilliant. He was supposed to go back and continue doing it, and I kept going because I want to go with you this time, and he couldn't get funding for it. They sent him to document how mercenary forces influenced the war. They sent him to study that. He couldn't get money to study nonviolence. So the case I went and visited people twice was at the Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant. Because whenever I talked to peace groups in Ukraine and said, what do you need from my government? More weapons, more weapons, more weapons. It gets back to that 90% of peace people actually just like to choose which side on the war and call that peace. I don't blame the Ukrainians for anything. I don't know what I would do if I was in their position. But they didn't choose much nonviolence. The exception was, I said, well, you can't take that nuclear power plant back with force, right? I know. Well, what else can we do? So a couple times I went back, and my idea, along with some other people's, was to try to get the civilians to get the local military commanders to stop shelling near the plant, which has been going on, and the International Atomic Energy Agency has been screaming about, you're going to have a Chernobyl if you keep doing this. Luckily, it hasn't happened yet, and they haven't done a heavy amount of shelling. When I went back 6 months after a frontline town right across the river where the Russians do shell, there was no more damage than there had been 6 months before, which was happy to see. So there's not a lot. If anything like Gaza was going on here, that plant would have gone up. But the point was, I found absolute, I have probably now 15 people that gave me the story. So when the Russian tanks came up in the first week of the war, the people went out like this and they just blocked the roads. The second day, they pulled trucks and burned tires and other things to block, and they went out and talked to them. They said, our mayor talked for hours and hours and hours to the military commander. I said, why didn't they just run over here? Well, our mayor was a good talker. What did they do? The tanks actually turned around and went out of sight. Came back the next day. By the third day, they were getting a little nervous. So they had all their local clergy put on their best vestments and everything and brought traditional Ukrainian gifts of friendship out. And they said, we mean you no harm, but please go away. And the Russians would say, no, we're here to liberate you. Oh, we're fine, thank you. So 3 days, they turned and went away. The fourth day, they didn't come until later in the day when a lot of the crowd had disappeared, and then the Russians fired on the National Guard base, the armed troops that were there to protect the plant. That battle lasted about 3 hours, some deaths, and the Russians had the plant. So I asked, and nobody I talked to in Ukraine, I said, I want to talk to the people. They didn't do anything. They lost the city. No value at all. But when I talked to the people, they had the same thing. We didn't do anything. We lost the city. I said, well, let me get this straight. 3.5 days, you held off the Russian army. How many people were killed? Well, none. We got one guy hurt his leg. And I said, and you held out for how long? Well, almost 4 days. And the National Guard, well, 3 hours. I said, do you think that's a little courage? And shouldn't you get a little credit for that? And they'd light up like nobody had given them credit for it. So I said, well, tell me about your training to do this. Who taught you to do this kind of bravery? Well, no, it just seemed like the right thing to do because we thought the army was going to come and do it, and they didn't. And sure enough, there were people in the back readying their rifles and making the Molotov cocktails and all that. And I said, well, if you had taken that approach, how would you have done? We mostly would have been killed, he said. So you saved a lot of lives, and your city is still intact. So 0 training, 0 preparation. Now imagine if you took a whole population and trained them to resist that way, in addition to all the other proactive things to stop the enemy before they get there with tanks. So that's civil resistance. And finally, a culture of peace, telling a new story. This is critical. Then education, research, journalism, involving non-traditional actors, women, youth, and indigenous. What does that mean? Well, the new story, right? The military story is the world is a limited place and a dangerous place, and it's us versus them. And if we don't take what we need, they're going to take it from us. And in that world, might makes right. National security is what they talk about, which is always involves a war, threat of war, punitive economic sanctions. There's probably as many people that die of economic sanctions, poor people, as from wars. Glorification of military and warriors. I see the same statues all over New Zealand to the Boer War and the world in Gallipoli, for God's sake. And what do they say? It's kind of vague things about honor and culture and God and king. I said, what did they die for? It's the same way in the American Civil War. I went to Manassas, big famous battle. And I asked the thing, I said, well, what side, what were they fighting over? And they got some, well, they were fighting for freedom. I said, which side? It was like, it's so vague about why people go to war. If you're going to go to war, you really ought to have it down like this, right? We're all interdependent. Justice makes right in a nonviolent scheme. Now, by justice, I mean, you could have what they call a negative peace, right? You can put a gun to somebody's head and you can look pretty darn peaceful because you're going to do what I say, right? That looks like peace to the guy with the gun. Does it feel like peace to you? No, of course not. Ask the Maori in 1881. No, and we believe only nonviolent action can make right, because when you use violence, when you force somebody to do something against their will, and especially if you cause a lot of trauma to their families, they will come back and get you. I can quote at least 2 American generals from Afghanistan that said, for every terrorist we kill, we're creating at least 10 more. The generals are saying that, and the politicians said, we'll keep killing them anyway. And that's what's happening in the Red Sea right now, right? The Houthis are saying, this is a genocide. The court says it's a genocide. It's our duty to stop a genocide, so we're going to stop any ships from Israel or going to Israel to supply them. Oh, you're interfering with international trade. And what's the answer? Kill them. Bomb them. Instead of, like one person said, well, a ceasefire would stop that. Oh, Houthis wouldn't stop. Well, they've never interfered with trade before, and they made a public statement, we're doing this to stop the genocide. And we will stop when it stops. Oh, we can't believe that, so we'll kill them. That's actually what's happening in the Red Sea right now. And I think New Zealand is playing a part in that, if I'm not mistaken. So think about that. Common security means that nobody's safe till everybody's safe. If you look at the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, their creed, or whatever they run on, specifically says that this is for the security of Europe. And nobody's security can be bought at the threat to somebody else. That was an agreed upon principle of those 58 nations. And that was kind of badly violated in the Ukraine war in the Donbass. And it was OSCE monitors. They had 1,000 peace monitors at one time. And they did document the killing, but they weren't allowed to say who was violating the treaty, because they were both Russian signatures and Ukrainian signature. And they were actually not Ukraine, but other OSCE members wouldn't allow them to report who was actually at fault. So they were a little weak there. But the idea is, people have agreed to this. If you look at Chinese statements, for what they want for the world, it's always that same statement. Your security cannot be bought by threatening somebody else. Very different. When I read my security documents for my country, it's all about total domination. we're God's gift to the world. That's not in the security thing, but it's the U.S. job to maintain the rules-based order, whatever the heck that is, something different from international law, obvious. It's our job to enforce that all over the world and dominate whoever opposes us. Those are the words they use: dominate, 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 all through our security documents. And of course, making friends by meeting human needs. The reason I highlighted those three of these, I have found deeply in what's presented as Maui culture here, right? You have Manaki and Whanangua, is it? The Whanangatanga interconnectedness. And then, of course, mutual aid, helping each other. And then peace education and research. There's international organizations like the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the Institute of Peace Education, lots of these around. But I'm really pleased to finally get here because I've been talking about this at every place. And here I am at Otago University, where you have the National Center for Peace and Conflict Studies. You need lots more of this, not less of it. Whatever it takes to fight for this, please do. By the way, we always dreamed of an academy for peace in the United States. And they eventually did one. It was called the U.S. Institute for Peace, government funded, which was great. But it's congressionally funded, and they're not allowed to say anything against U.S. foreign policy. And so it's kind of anemic, but it's better than nothing. But before it got so bad, they were going to shut it down. When Reagan came in, he said, that's worthless. Our peace, we have 4 great peace academies: the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard. We don't need another peace academy. You know who spoke up for the peace academy? The generals. They're the ones that saved its measly little $40 million budget. But fight for this. And of course, you have this book that I want to talk a bit about in conversation. Richard and his students here have made, a really good point. Let's just put this question out there. Is what we're doing with the money on the military worth it? And let me ask you this: how many people here think most of what the New Zealand military does is humanitarian work or UN peacekeeping missions? How many people? Some. This is the first audience where it's been that little, so you must be having some effect locally here. Most of it is about 80% of people say, oh yeah, that's what New Zealand does. Well, in fact, as Richard says in the book here, if you look at where the money's going to expensive military equipment that has interoperability with NATO and the US forces, and where their missions are, is it protecting New Zealand? Is it establishing peace in the Pacific? No, 80% of the missions have been in the Middle East, which how much good have they done? What does all that peacekeeping, all that military action done for Afghanistan? We spent $6 trillion, 20 years of misery and destroying the environment in Afghanistan and turned it back over to the Taliban, all right? What have we done to prevent the Hamas-Israeli thing? We give $4 billion a year to Israel for military hardware, on top of the $20 billion they give themselves. And if $24 billion a year isn't enough to keep a couple of guys with guns and RPGs out of their border, why do we think $14 billion more will help in any way? So, great book, highly recommend you read it and talk about it, including the wisdom of non-traditional stakeholders. And this is why it's been so wonderful to be in Aotearoa, right? Because you have this treaty with Tangi, and you have this thing that happened at Parahaka, right? And I just read Dick Scott's book. I don't know who's read that, but the British were ready to finish off. This was like, they don't quite use the words, but it's pretty darn close. When Bryce went in, it's like, this is the final solution. Anybody hear that before? Finally get rid of these pesky natives that make it hard to take the land for free. And it's been a major part. Well, women in Liberia did the same thing. Brutal civil war. If you watch this movie by Abigail Disney, it's just this handful of movies I mentioned. Please write them down and watch them at some point. But at the beginning of the movie, you see what I would view as a kind of a typical African war. Young men going at each other, shooting, lopping off arms, raping women, everybody screaming in terror. And by the end of the movie, the women who forced the government into peace, they went off to Ghana to make peace. They didn't do a good enough job. The women came there, surrounded the building, and wouldn't let them out until they made a peace treaty. By the end of the movie, the women are going, give me that gun. Yes, ma'am. The same guys that were doing the killing. Phenomenal, because they brought in women who are naturally much better peacekeepers, I think, than men. And then, of course, there's Tohu and Taviti, right? These guys, they were down to a couple thousand people at Parahaka. They had a beautiful landscape, many square kilometers of cultivated fields. You should read this if you haven't. You may have read it already, but the stuff the British were saying, these are madmen. They live in utter desolation and poverty and disease. And there's, a doctor went in. Is that true? He said they're incredibly healthy. Their diet is unbelievable. They're in great shape. But they went in to slaughter them, and they were fully prepared, full military armament, fully prepared to wipe them out entirely if they resisted. Instead, they were met with children dancing and playing and singing songs, and they did trample them. I don't think they killed too many, but they eventually arrested everybody, deported all a small group. But look at the legacy. Read Tavete's last words right before the British came in that morning. They thought they'd come in the middle of the night. They were really surprised. They'd been up waiting for them all night. They didn't come until like 9 o'clock in the morning. But he said, it doesn't matter what they do with us now. What we did here will last forever. And now, 180 years later? Not 180, but 100 and... How many years later? 150 years later, right? People are still talking about it. They're proud of it. And look what it's done for New Zealand culture. And I'm not talking about the things like changing language and street signs or names. I mean, that's good. But what really matters is what it did for the Bougainvilleers. All those other armed peacekeepers couldn't do it, but Maori culture blended with a desire of all New Zealanders to make their neighborhood more peaceful. It's an amazing story. Getting on to what World Beyond War does besides that kind of education is divestment. All right, as long as there's money in weapons, people are going to sell weapons and make weapons. You take the money out of it, they'll stop. There's been a lot of examples. They've gone to corporate boardrooms. Well, could you make something besides these cluster munitions? Oh yeah, we can make these, whatever we have a market for. So divesting, and I was very pleased to know, I'm just learning what Kyiv, who is involved in some way with Kiwi Saver here? Anybody know that term and has money in? Okay. Apparently it's some invested funds that you, I guess, invest part of your retirement or something in. Well, look, in 2021, somebody asked to report how they're doing on particular kinds of weapons, and a little weak on cluster bombs. But nuclear weapons, 100%. I guess you'd expect that in a nuclear-free zone. But even anti-personnel mines. No, they make sure that none of their money, and these are their different funds, I guess, is invested in those things. That's huge. There's a big campaign worldwide specifically focused on nuclear weapons. We got our city in Burlington, Vermont to say they'll take all their funds out of any weapons manufacturers. Closing bases is a big one. I talked about Sinahavina. This is in West Palpa, this Tambraw community, was doing the same thing. They had a little community up here, and the military wanted to establish a base, and they fought it tooth and nail, came to us for help. We did a webinar, fundraiser. I haven't been able to get a follow-up, though, in the last year on this. In fact, we met somebody last night that was from West Palpa. He hadn't heard of it. But the people that were involved were very grateful for this. Our latest project is, because we have Liz here and a board member in Australia, this is huge, with AUKUS for you all, right? Because Australia, the UK, and the US want to tighten that chain around China, and Australia is agreeing to buy over, 10 years, $300 billion worth of nuclear-powered submarines, which certainly would violate their no nuclear policy. But mostly, if you were China, what would you think about that? And so New Zealand's got a big question about it. But if you want to know anything about AUKUS, Liz has information, but you could go to our latest webpage and it says, what is AUKUS, what's it about, what's involved, why it's good or bad, and educate yourselves. So please correct me if I'm wrong here, but after 5 weeks in New Zealand, not very long, you can say better than I, it looks like the challenges I see New Zealand making with regard to the world geopolitical scene are whether to reform or replace the defense force to stop spending money on combat readiness to, in my view as a USian, support US aggression. And in general, most of us feel that our government does not represent us very well. Like 61% across the board in every poll shows there should be a ceasefire in Gaza, and the government won't do it. But to review, what are the real threats to New Zealand, and what can you do about them besides train people for combat? And then what position to take in a growing US-China confrontation. Being in DC area is a little bit scary for me because I've known how my government works, but I've never watched them work for a while. You go into a Senate Foreign Affairs Committee meeting, and I watched them grill our Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, and he thought they were going to talk about Ukraine. He said, okay, you just get Ukraine done with, just get it done with, because China is what it's all about. We have to beat China. We have to beat China. If we can't do it without war, we'll do it with war. That's what we need to get ready for. And that's not going to be very pretty. And they're a nuclear power. They're increasing their nuclear weapons for the first time since '63, and nobody in my government is trying to get them to stop increasing their weapons. Rather, we're using it as an excuse to modernize and make new ones of our own. We need your help. So those are two questions I'd love to cover in discussions. Just to finish up here, our membership is 194 countries. We have signatures on this Declaration of Peace. I'll show you in a minute. We'd love you to join us. 831 organizations. If you have an organization that agrees, please sign on. We have affiliates, that is peace groups that are working, that likes our goals, but you don't need to join World Beyond War, just be an affiliate, then you get reinforced with some help that's on our website, the particulars. And then actual chapters, people that don't have their group of their own can start a chapter. And we have those in 8 countries. So I'm going to ask you for 3 things. One is, you can ponder the words of Eleanor Roosevelt. It's not enough to talk about peace. One must believe in it, and it is enough to believe in it. You must work at it. So think of World Beyond War as helping you believe more in it and working at it. Second, if you'll sign our Declaration of Peace, we understand that wars and militarism make us less safe rather than protect us. They kill, injure, and traumatize adults, children, and infants, severely damage the natural environment, of course, including all our pets and animals, erode civil liberties, drain economies, siphoning resources from life-affirming activities. It's just one sentence. War sucks. And the second sentence is, we commit to engage in and support nonviolent efforts to end all war and preparations for war, and to create a sustainable and just peace. So Laurie will be passing a thing around. If you sign that, then we'll also put you on the listserv to get information. And the third thing is, visit our website. And there are so many things on there. Any issue you're involved in that has anything to do with ending war will be in there. And I just ask you to go into yourself, where am I? You're here because you had some passion for peace. Find out what that is. It doesn't have to be much. It could be signing one of our petitions. It could be starting a chapter. Anything, but train yourself. The biggest threat to peace is our education, especially our learned helplessness, that you can't make a difference. That's what the people at the top that want to make war need you, absolutely essential for you to believe that it's not worth your time, that you're helpless, that you can't make a difference. So I've gotten a lot of stories about how you became a nuclear-free zone, and everybody agrees. It started with a few people and then spread. Individual houses putting up a sign, this house is a nuclear-free zone. Who would care about that? Nobody, right? And yet then somebody started driving around the country getting signatures, 500,000 signatures. Then they started having meetings and demonstrations, all kinds of clever things. What's the new one I said? They were dancing. Not make dance, not war. It was something kind of funny. A dance for peace. But is anybody, I read about this before, but haven't confirmed it. Everybody knows what a boycott is, right? There was a girl cot that I read somewhere started in New Zealand. Has anybody ever heard of a girl cot? Maybe they were faulty. Haven't found it yet. It was some clever way of stopping, changing expectations for a local thing. And it helped you resist the U.S. hegemony. So thank you for listening. Now I want some feedback and some questions, and teach me something about how to be a better peacemaker.
Great, thanks so much. A lot to ponder there. So yeah, let's have some kōrero about this. And what we'll do is, because it's being recorded and there's people online, I will come around with this microphone and I'll ask you to speak clearly into the microphone to ask your question. So did someone you raised your hand, did you? Oh, okay.
Who am I?
Thank you very much. To honour that it's just a few days after the passing of the anti-corruption activist, lawyer and Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, I would like to bring up the subject of corruption. I know that the United Nations... Oh, sorry. I'm very aware that the United Nations is has put into place a number of strategies, a convention against corruption, national anti-corruption strategies, etc. And that research has shown that corruption very considerably affects development, national development and security. Was there nothing more that could have been done to save Alexei Navalny from what happened to him? Because that was a very clear message, I think, to anybody who stands up legally and actively against oligarchy and grand corruption in this world.
I don't know enough about Navalny to say what his case was. There are numerous videos that show how anti-immigrant he was, said some terrible things. That's not the point. The point is, what allows an authoritarian government or any government to suppress? It's almost always secrecy, right? Corruption can thrive when in the darkness. It can't thrive very well in the light. And so one of the reasons to be against war is, again, so civil liberties don't become eroded. In wartime, everything is secret, right? Is it? Can people hear me? Okay.
It's not that loud.
Oh, okay.
Talk into that.
So wartime always requires secrecy, right? Everything's top secret because you don't want the enemy to know. But that means also the population doesn't know. And that allows corruption to thrive. So the last time it was in Ukraine, and we're trying to see if local people felt threatened enough by, because these poor folks know that the Russian artillery could hit them in any day, and they could also, if the plant went out, would be the first to be irradiated and die. And we were surprised at that time to find they were just as concerned that their local mayor was stealing humanitarian aid. So corruption is huge in all governments, but in governments at war, it's always worse. So the war culture allows things to happen like Navalny. And what do we have on the US side? To me, it's the same thing. And the Australian side, right? You have Julian Assange. You know, all he did was show the lies in great detail about what the US wars in the Middle East were actually doing rather than what we were told they were doing. And he's been in prison for 10 years. He looks as ragged as Navalny did before he just died. And he'll almost certainly die soon if they extradite him to the United States. So it's not just the big bad Russians, it's governments at the top who are protecting national security rather than human security. That's probably not a totally satisfactory answer to your question, but what do you do? Openness and stop war. All dictators need war to survive.
A question over there.
Thank you. My name is Sang. I'm from Myanmar. I'm not quite sure how many of the people in the room have heard of my country, Myanmar. This is a country where parallel or sort of a little bit earlier military war and the coup process has been going on since February 2021. And with this country, what I wanted to ask here today is, you mentioned in your PowerPoint presentation that what is the profit that you would receive from war? But in our country, a country with more than 70 years of civil conflicts, and a country with all the mechanisms of peace and also justice process, you name it, like the international justice, ICJ, ICC, we are there, but it couldn't really stop the authoritarian and the military regimes that is killing people, that is stopping humanitarian assistance in Myanmar. So in such cases, the civilians ends up actually supporting funding to resist those military. And I just wanted to know your perspective on that, such a situation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Still not very loud here. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. A lot of what I learned about nonviolent resistance involved Burma, because Nonviolence International in particular, Gene Sharp, one of my mentors, went there, right, and taught a lot of people about nonviolent resistance, and they've tried many, many things as they have tried violent resistance. Here's the thing about nonviolence. the most important thing is to remember to level the playing field. This was taught to me by the folk singer Joan Baez. She says, why is it when people try nonviolent resistance and 50 get killed that people say, see, it doesn't work? And so you have a civil war, 100,000 people die, and they say, what do you expect? That's war. Let's keep doing war. So nothing has worked very well in Burma. We had great hope for Aung San Suu Kyi, right? She was, the movie Rangoon. I just watched her reenactment of that, and I go, oh, wow. So we were heartbroken, of course, when she had some power, and I don't know, you probably have a much better perspective of what happened to her. But nothing works all the time. What we do know, and this has been statistically proven by Erica Chenoweth's and Miria Stefan's work, is that if you're trying to overthrow a dictatorial government and you use nonviolence, you're much more likely to succeed. Now, does it guarantee you succeed? No. In fact, when they published this groundbreaking research in 2011, if you use nonviolence, and this was case studies, 326 case studies between 1900 and 2006, you were about 50% chance of success with nonviolence and about a 24% chance with violence. It's like a no-brainer, always go for nonviolence. But because so much has been learned about governments, about nonviolent resistance, now you're actually 3 times as likely to succeed using nonviolence. Are you aware of these statistics? Good for you. But the chances of anybody's success using nonviolence is down to about 25%, and using violence is down to about 8 or 9%. So governments are becoming more savvy in countering this, but like all offensive and defensive conflict, we have to put money and effort into learning how to do this better. War is clearly a dead end. It clearly is inferior for establishing prosperity, freedom, democracy. There's no question about that now. So our appeal on war is let's take that off the table. Stop voting for bigger military budgets. Does it guarantee if you use nonviolence it's going to work? Not at all. But violence certainly doesn't work, and we know now it works a lot less of the time, except for one thing. And that is, if your goal is to allow a few people to dominate the many, then armies and war are absolutely necessary. If that's your goal, great, go for it. But the rest of us who want prosperity and peace, no. Tell your government every time, no more violence. And New Zealand has so much to offer the rest of the world in this. You've done all these brilliant things. You can, please, don't give up. Keep working. Find your passion. Add whatever contribution you can make. I'm going to put on my blue scarf. This is a World Beyond War symbol that we all live under the same blue sky and that we all have to work together to survive.
Okay, kia ora, John. And thanks for so much that a lot of us are going to feel we're in harmony with. And I'm grateful that you've offered a whole lot of strategies that we as ordinary people can deploy. But I'm feeling a gap. You've touched several times on the way in which the arms trade, the way in which money flows towards war, and which people profit from war, and it's big stuff. Now, do you have strategies by which we as the ordinary citizens can help undermine that?
Absolutely. 2 major ways. One is divestment.
Hold on.
Oh, yes. 2 ways. One is divestment, as I talked about there. Make sure that your personal retirement funds and whatever wealth you have is not invested in weapons. And make sure that this university, and luckily New Zealand's ahead of the curve on this too, we have a lot more work to do in the US. It makes a difference, particularly with nuclear weapons. The international campaign against those now has gotten major banks with almost $1 trillion worth of assets now to divest from nuclear weapons. So that's one huge way. The other way is to get your government to not push for military alliances and buying of weapons. In the US, it's clearly shown that with this huge the war budget we have of almost $900 billion a year now, half of that goes into the pockets of no more than 25 weapons manufacturing corporations. $450 billion gift to these weapons manufacturers to prepare for death and destruction. So those are the 2 channels. I know if somebody else wants to offer another, please.
You mentioned the fact that in war you have censorship. The information doesn't get out. That's one of the problems. Well, one of the things we're facing, I think, in the modern world is that there, especially when you talk about the economy, the first thing you hear is it's business confidential. That we really don't know what happens to our money, and oftentimes while we may be told we can find out, it's very difficult to find out, and the usual argument against it is business confidentiality. And for instance, in the United States, you can give money to political parties or politicians in any amount, and it's considered part of freedom of speech. So don't we have to deal with economic power and inequality at the same time we deal with nonviolence and trying to end war? Aren't they connected? Can you ever have war if you have extreme inequality? And we've seen inequality increase, not only in America, but in New Zealand and other places, especially the English-speaking world.
Yeah, thank you, Marvin. That's a really good point. Obviously, with the more wealth inequality, the more people you have in a population whose needs aren't met, you have more unhappy people. And that leads to social unrest. Social unrest is usually dealt with by some military force. In the U.S., the thing is militarization of our police forces. You know, when I was a kid, you saw friendly-looking men with a badge that might have had a gun, but they were friendly. They were community policing. And now, almost any crime at all is a SWAT team. It looks like full military. That's happening in many, many places. But there are still lots of countries, including New Zealand, I think, where most officers aren't armed most of the time. You want to preserve that. As far as wealth inequality goes, that's very complex, because the same propaganda machine that convinces you need war convinces you to be happy with the status quo, where the economic system is such it's easy for the money to flow out of your pocket into the wealthiest people. That's a tough thing to bear, because in some ways people are bribed, right? They make our lives so easy. A difference between dealing with a government trying to get them to stop war and dealing with a corporation who's sucking money out of you is, in my opinion, it's a little easier to deal with a corporation, because governments have the ability to hurt you, put you in jail, or physically hurt you legally.
Corporations do too.
Well, corporations can buy that kind of police protection, but where corporations are susceptible is divestment and in not buying their products. Just stop buying their products. And every company that you're annoyed with or you think is sucking up too much money. Now, does that mean? That means you have to go deeper into your own spirituality, because you're going to have to do with a little less materially, right? But that's not all that hard. As I say, people we live in a civilization that's just astounding, right? 100 years ago, the ordinary person now lives better than any king could in those days. They didn't have air conditioning, malaria and smallpox were still rampant. The vast majority of human beings can live better than kings just 100 years ago. Can't we take a little of that energy, and instead of putting another vacation or another car, put it into hiring people to make peace and spending a little of our time making the world the way we want it? There are activist groups that are astounding, working on inequality. Just read, who's the former Secretary of Treasury for the U.S. is a short guy, Robert Reich. Just get on his Twitter feed. He'll talk endlessly about wealth inequality and what to do about it. It's a matter of, again, overcoming that learned helplessness that I can't do anything about it. The powers that be are just too great. They're not. They're us. They can't do anything without our cooperation. But it does sometimes mean self-sacrifice. But isn't that one of the things that keeps war going? What people really admire about soldiers is their willingness to sacrifice. Right? Look at all the monuments around. There's something appealing that young man was willing to see me more important than his own life. Now, if you were to look at it, it wasn't me. It was some king somewhere, right? That he was giving his life for. But does that make any sense? If it doesn't, yes, speak up, because these are interesting conversations.
About 10 years ago, I spent a week study leave at Eastern Mennonite University, and they're doing great work there. And one idea that they were advocating was for people to refuse to pay the portion of their tax that went towards military armaments. I'm not sure how they'd actually implement that with the tax laws, but do you know if that can be done? That was an idea that I heard a lot about when I was there, is that can Americans do that?
A subject dear to my heart, thank you. Can Americans avoid paying taxes for war? And I've been to Eastern Mennonite many times, wonderful, wonderful people there. Tax resistance can be done in 3 ways in the US. I know our tax system fairly well. And that's the one commitment I'm finally ready to make in my old age years, right? Because Social Security isn't taxed as much. So as long as I'm willing to live modestly, I can avoid paying any taxes, and I'm dedicated to that. And after Ukraine and Gaza, I'm even more dedicated to that. That's a hard thing to do. Earlier in life, I said that isn't worth the price to my family because they'll come and take more money. So there's 3 ways to do tax resistance, but that's the US. You want to hear that anyway? Okay. There's 3 ways. One is just live below the taxable level. Luckily, we have a tax system merciful enough that if you stay under a certain level, you don't pay taxes. Yeah. Well, that's the second. So that's one way. That's the safest way because nobody's going to punish you for that. But you live kind of in voluntary sort of poverty, which isn't the worst thing in the world. You could still be fed. You're not going to be grinding in the gutter. The second way is to refuse to pay. And one of the founders of World Beyond War, David Hartsoe, is an amazing guy in his own right. He's never paid taxes willingly. So what he did was find out each year how much was going to the military. He'd write a check for that to some peace organization. And then he wrote the other check to the Department of Health and Human Services with a letter saying, I can't pay for war. I said, David, it's kind of a waste of time, right? Because they're going to come and get it and then charge you a penalty too. And so you're actually going to give them more. He said, no, this is, with my relatively low salary as it was, he still needed to pay taxes. But he said, it took them 12 years to come get me. And the money they spent tracking me down and did it, they spent so much more money than that than they did on the penalties I paid, that it was worth it. So that's a way. The other way, at least he said, I never agreed to pay this. So if they want to come take it at gunpoint, that is a better moral position, perhaps. The third way is like Trump. The third way is the US tax system is built for businesses. And while I did pay taxes, I had a good salary as an emergency physician, but there are so many tax deductions you can take if you're your own business. So I worked really hard to only work in places where they would allow me to be what they call an independent contractor and not an employee. Because your employer's obligated to take a certain amount of money out. But I did my own, and I funneled it into my mortgage on the house was tax deductible. My children, I had a lot of children, they were tax deductible, thank God. And then my charities. I always enjoyed giving money to causes and for charity. And so I paid a tiny piece of taxes compared to most of my friends because it was important to me not to pay war taxes. Now that retirement fund is sitting there, not as big as I would like it because of divorce, but it's there. And I have to take it out very slowly as to avoid paying, because if I took it all out, I'd pay a huge amount. I'd pay a third of it in taxes. And I don't. So I'm going to take it out slow enough that I never pay taxes again. So those are the 3 ways I know of, and I'm happy to hear it can be done. Absolutely. Without living in poverty. We might be better off. The planet would burn up less fast.
That's right. Talk to Bill McKibben.
Yeah, I have.
Yes, you are the President of the United States. In terms of a specific case, what would you convey to Israel at this point to bring the carnage there to a constructive forward process?
I get to be President of the United States for a minute? Cool. I would never take the job, but in the case of Gaza and Israel, I would go over there personally, and I'd meet with Bibi, and I'd say, this has to stop today. Absolutely stops today. You will not receive one bit of aid. We're going right to the Security Council and get the whole world to condemn you for not doing this if you don't stop today. He probably wouldn't even have to say all that. He probably has to say, it's time to stop, Bibi, and he would stop. Now, they might not. Israelis, and please, in my mind, Israelis and Zionists are totally different from the Jewish population. The worst thing happening in the world for Jews right now is for people to equate those. So our presidential candidate, Nikki Haley, says anybody who criticizes Israel is anti-Semitic. Half the Jews in the world do not like Zionism. Every demonstration we've gone to has been led by Jewish young people who said, this is not Judaism. It's not Judaism. And what's happening now is, if I were trying to make anti-Semitism in the world, I would put Jews on display as doing horrific things to people, right? And that's what they're doing. This is suicide almost for the state of Israel as I see it. They're forcing a position where nothing but their guns are going to do them any good at all anymore, and that's not going to end well. So the U.S. has certainly enough on Israel to stop this tomorrow. And that's why I spent a lot of my time in the halls of Congress screaming at these guys, because you can't have a meeting with them. You have to catch them in the halls and scream at them half the time. You can meet with their staff, but to say, stop this. This is not good for us. It's not good for anybody.
Interestingly, there is a precedent in the 1980s when Israel was attacking Lebanon because the PLO were there. The devastation was quite high and graphic, and Ronald Reagan rang up the president of Israel and said, this has got to stop, and they stopped. So it is possible for the US to use its leverage to try and bring this to a close. But
Kia ora, one of the things you said was that we need to strengthen the work of the United Nations. I think that they are saying things, but we can't see the results of that. How can we strengthen these resolutions?
I think we have somebody here from the United Nations Association. Would you like to take the first stab at that? then correct. I'm not an expert on the United Nations at all. In some ways, it was set up so that the 5 winners of World War II could dominate it, right? They have a veto, and Russia and the United States have used most of those vetoes just to block really good stuff. Otherwise, Israel would have been stopped a long time ago by sanctions from the United Nations. I don't know how many vetoes just for Israel, but it's in the dozens that the U.S. has used, including vetoing recent ceasefire resolutions, right? So I don't know how to do that. I don't know if it works. I have heard that the General Assembly has some power, and there's legal ways sometimes to get around and get things done without the Security Council agreeing to it. Whether it can be reformed, whether the nations of the world can say, hey, we're not going to cooperate with the Security Council anymore until you make these changes. I can imagine that happening. Or whether we have to start all over. I have a good friend at Radford University who's dedicated his life to the World Constitution and Parliament Association. And since the 50s, they have written an entire constitution of 3 houses of government for the world. I was always afraid of world government because the bigger the government gets, the worse it is in my mind. But this is a totally demilitarized government, only enough police force to arrest individuals, no war-making capacity to join this. So that's out there. They have meetings every 2 or 3 years, mostly in India. It's what they call a parallel institution. In other words, if the United Nations ever failed, they could come, and if people wanted to join it, they could. And that's a very valuable contribution. You never want to overthrow a government or any institution until you got something better to replace it with. UN is lousy in a lot of ways, but it's all we've got. I think the peacekeepers in South Sudan were doing some good, but the other organizations that allow people together and do things besides fight with each other is still there. Desperately needs work. There we go.
The United Nations does hold meetings with representatives from every country in the world. So any country can come up with resolutions that they want to have happen. I know New Zealand recently was represented, and they were really happy that, say, 2 of their 4 resolutions actually got accepted, and they thought that was really important. But I think if there was a situation where every country decided to put something forth against war, what do you think an impact that would serve? Do you think that would be an impact? Or do you think it's a waste of time? Yes? Yeah. Okay. So think about that. I just want to ask a question, if I wouldn't mind. There's always a thing that something can be done about it. That's a really good slogan to have, to give to everyone. But, we've got so much oppression and so much suppression in this world that we really have to overcome. How many, what numbers of people do you think are needed without war, without guns, that need to make an impact, let's say, on the justice system, so that the people who are perpetrating for us to keep on having war can be offloaded?
Well, let's start with your example, New Zealand, right? You were part of the ANZUS Treaty since World War II. Anything Britain said to defend their empire, and later when the U.S. assumed the empire, anything you did. Until a few people said, these nuclear things are not very friendly toward us, and they could do us in. And a few people started. I've been told that initially there was one van going around collecting signatures, and that's been confirmed, but in addition to many other things that were happening. And within a relatively few years, it snowballed. So when you say how many people, well, it might have started with 10. The studies about nonviolent resistance being superior in terms of getting rid of oppressive governments, as part of that research data showed what percentage of the population has to be actively involved to change a government. Does anybody know what that figure is? Things start to happen when it becomes around 1.5% of the population. It can't not change once 3.5% of the population are actively engaged. And you had much more than that in New Zealand with the nuclear-free zone. So if you keep those numbers in mind, in the U.S., that only amounts to about 11 million people. It's incredibly low, but 11 million people to mobilize is a very hard thing to do. But those are the numbers. It's we have research to back that up.
So does the Justice Department listen to that?
Once enough people bug the Justice Department, they will. Yes, and that number seems to be 3.5% of the population that's very active, makes it almost inevitable to change. They begin to take notice when it becomes near 1%, and sometimes they notice fewer people, depending on how good they are and how vulnerable the powers that be are and how open they are. In South Africa, I've talked to a lot of people that were there for the anti-apartheid movement. They said, no way that's ever going to happen. No way it's ever going to happen. You never know when a de Klerk is going to come into power or a Gorbachev is going to come into power. Not everybody's evil. And no one person, none of us are capable of total good all the time or total evil all the time.
All right, just a couple more questions.
Thank you. This phrase, rules-based order, which seems to be a euphemism for something else, can you describe what rules-based order is and what its more positive other wording is?
My expertise comes from two things. One, just hearing that, almost always associated with something I wish my government wasn't doing. All right, so that was my personal experience with it. What are they saying? Because I never heard it much before a couple of years ago. And then I found a paper which I could find for you and share with you where somebody did an academic study of who said it first, when they said it, what it meant. And basically they confirmed my suspicion that it's a euphemism for what that government wants to do rather than international law. See, there's a system of international law, international humanitarian law, the Genocide Conventions, the Geneva Conventions, that outlaw war and most aspect of wars and determine the rules of war. And those are all things that countries signed on to and agreed to, right? The Declaration of Human Rights. Rules-based order has no such backing whatsoever. It's something, and they quote the first person who said it. I've been kind of surprised to hear New Zealand has it in their official papers too now. And I don't know what that means. But I know in the US, it means whatever the US says. I don't see any body of law that says it means anything more than that. And please correct me if I could easily be wrong there.
Good evening. So we've had lots of questions around all of the peace and all that sort of stuff. But I guess my question relates to, what do you think should happen when people violate those sorts of decisions? What consequences should be happening when countries do go to invade all these peaceful areas and all that sort of stuff? Because yes, the first step is to be active against it and all that sort of stuff. But then what steps do you think should happen and all that sort of stuff? And it's something that's often questioned in the criminal justice system and all that sort of stuff, that it's never truly correct, because how can it be truly correct? Because it changes as society changes. So in this perfect, peaceful, like, anti-war world, how should it be penalized when people go against that?
Thank you for the question. If I heard you correctly, you gave a very polite, soft form of a question that every person that speaks for peace gets asked. What would you do if somebody comes in and tries to kill your grandmother right in the house? What are you going to do when Hitler invades Poland? What do you do when Russia invades Ukraine? You still have options to be nonviolent. Gandhi was asked, what do you do about Hitler? He says, stop cooperating with him, right? Hitler had no power. Putin has no power. They have lots of young men who serve him, right? In the Ukraine war, 700,000 Russian young men left the country rather than fight in Ukraine. If I were looking for something besides slaughter to do, I would have gone to every one of those guys, given them an apartment to stay in, taking care of them to make sure they don't go in and attack Ukraine, and induced each one of them to talk to their friends back home and get them to leave too. And once a certain amount left, Russia would no longer be capable of punishing them if they went back. That's a radical thing. Is it any more radical than this trench warfare, 1914 style that's going on now as some kind of solution to the problem? When you give up violence and the willingness to pay this horrible price to the environment and to human beings, it seems like prevention becomes a little more important. You know, if you want war, and there's lots of people like weapons manufacturers who like war and benefit from war, then you don't want those preemptive things to happen. If you agree that's off the table, you're not going to buy weapons from those guys, you're going to do it another way, you never let it get to that point. See? I hope that makes some sense. Yes, there's always something, but even in the case where Russia comes across the border, there were things that could be done. They actually had a peace agreement a month after it started that was based on the Minsk Accords that could have prevented the war in the first place. But the Turkish government and the French government were in Istanbul, and they came up with a plan that Russia was ready to accept. Boris Johnson magically appeared as the first Western leader out in the open and not in bomb shelters in Kyiv. And after that, Zelensky made a statement that we want all our territory back. We're not going to have peace. So that could have been done. Does that make sense in this case? Yeah. I mean, you can always create a situation where you take everything else off the table and nothing works except killing the person, right? But that's not real life.
I think I'm not necessarily arguing towards the killing or things like that. I think my question was more based towards the, like, somebody has attacked or invaded or whatever, then we've come to that peaceful agreement, it's been met with that peaceful, all that sort of stuff. And then the peace agreement has happened, all that sort of stuff. Like, what punishment should that country then face as consequence of going against that nation and attacking and, like, in certain ways, war reparations, all that sort of stuff. Because the reality is a lot of the times, it's the war reparations that can often lead to more war in future, things like that.
That was clearly the case in 1918, right? After World War I, we were so rough on Germany that the people were miserable. So some nice guy that says, let's make Germany great again comes along, named Hitler, and it leads to World War II. Totally predicted by lots of people after World War I. And we've got to prevent that kind of thing. That's why you use international courts. You know, they did take Putin to the ICC over transferring children, kidnapping children from Ukraine. Did you notice one change in his behavior? He wouldn't travel after that. He didn't go to South Africa. He didn't go because those signatures to the International Criminal Court were obligated to punish him, to arrest him there. Of course, he said, well, anybody that does that is an act of war and will go to war against that country. That's what he said publicly, but he didn't travel. So it makes a huge difference. There's always options.
Thank you very much. You can tell when we've had a wonderful talk because people want to keep asking questions and going on and on. But we have to start drawing this to a close. Liz, do you have some things to add?
Yeah, I've just got a few things. Thank you. Thanks, Richard. Thanks, John, for that wonderful talk. Wasn't that great? Let's give him a little hand. So I just want to give you a chance to find out how you can support if you agree with what John says and what our movement is doing. We'd be very grateful for koha. And we've also got a bank account if you don't have any cash. We've got some buttons here. Where's Laurie? Oh, Laurie's going to give out some buttons and some stickers, bookmarks, and we're selling these scarves that John's wearing. It's a symbol from Afghanistan. We all live under a blue sky, and it was a movement that's created by Afghan youth as a way of making them keeping hopefulness during that terrible 20-year war. So we've got some things over there. And thanks for signing our sheets. And now I'd just like to say just a quick something or other about our new Stop AUKUS campaign, because this is just really important as we are pressured by overseas countries for our government to get involved in this new military campaign, which is basically about supporting a nuclear-armed submarines that are being built for Australia, which are attack submarines, and it's towards creating this new war in China. So it's the new campaign, and we've got lots of information about this here. It's so new; it hasn't even got a new website, but that's coming really, really soon. And so I'd love you to get involved with that. If you'd like to be active, please sign this sheet here, and I'll get in touch with you. Or we are starting a national campaign. We have lots of these stickers which you can spread around. I mean, let's face it, most people don't really know what AUKUS is, do we? Not really. It stands for Australian, United Kingdom and United States. And there's going to be some actions coming up on in Anzac Day. This campaign is starting to become active. So that's really all I want to say, and thank you again. Ngā mihi nui. Kia ora.
Great. Please, one more time. Thanks to John. Thank you for coming. Good night, and we hope to see you again.